So welcome to the first hearing of the Select Committee into Animal Cruelty Laws in New South Wales. The inquiry is examining the effectiveness of arrangements for the administration and enforcement of the laws of New South Wales for the protection of animals from cruelty. Before I commence, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay respect to the elders past and present of the Eora Nation and extend that respect to other Aboriginals present. Today we will hear from government officials, legal representatives, animal welfare organisations and industry representatives. Before we commence, I would like to make some brief comments about the procedures for today's hearing. Today's hearing is open to the public and is being broadcast live via the Parliament's website. A transcript of today's hearing will be placed on the committee's website when it becomes available. In accordance with the broadcasting guidelines, while members of the media may film or record committee members and witnesses, people in the public gallery should not be the primary focus of any filming or photography. I would also remind media representatives that you must take responsibility for what you publish about the committee's proceedings. It is important to remember that parliamentary privilege does not apply to what witnesses may say outside of their evidence at this hearing. And so I urge witnesses to be careful about any comments you may make to the media or to others after you have given your evidence, as such comments would not be protected by parliamentary privilege if another person decided to take an action for defamation. The guidelines for the broadcast of proceedings are available from the Secretariat. All witnesses, There may be some questions that a witness could only answer if they had more time and certain documents to hand. In these circumstances, witnesses are advised that they can take a question on notice and provide the answer within 21 days. I remind everyone here today that committee hearings are not intended to provide a forum for people to make adverse reflections about others under the protection of parliamentary privilege. I therefore request that witnesses focus on the issues raised here by the inquiry's terms of reference and avoid naming individuals unnecessarily. Witnesses are advised that any messages should be delivered to committee members through the committee staff. To aid the audibility of this hearing, may I remind both committee members and witnesses to speak into the microphones, both the long one and the short one. The room is fitted with induction loops compatible with hearing aid systems and have telecoil receivers. In addition, several seats have been reserved near the loudspeakers for persons in the public gallery who have hearing difficulties. Finally, could everyone please turn their mobile phones to silent for the duration of the hearing? I'd like now to welcome our first witness. Could each witness start from my left by stating their name and position title and swear either an oath or an affirmation? Thank you, Mr. Whiteside.
Cameron Whiteside, Detective Inspector, State Rural Crime Coordinator for the Rural Crime Prevention Team of the New South Wales Police Force. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Suzanne Robinson?
Suzanne Robinson, Director Animal Welfare with DPI. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Mr. Scott Hansen, you have to...
I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
And you might want to put on the record your title and...
Scott Hansen, Director General, New South Wales Department of Primary Industries.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Peter Day.
Yeah, Peter Day, Director of Compliance and Integrity Systems with New South Wales DPI, and I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Bruce Christie.
Bruce Christie, Deputy Director General, Biosecurity and Food Safety with Department of Primary Industries. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you very much. Would any of the witnesses like to commence with a short statement?
Yes, Chair.
Mr. Whiteside?
If I could, Mr. Chair. New South Wales Police Force are the primary authority in enforcing laws that are designed to protect animal cruelty. I'm delighted here to speak here today as a State Coordinator for the Rural Crime Prevention Team on behalf of the Commissioner of Police. In the calendar year of 2019, the New South Wales Police Force recorded 1,001 incidents of animal cruelty. Just over half of these were cruelty to dogs, with 544 incidents. Cruelty to cattle, cats and sheep were the following highest, in reports being 78, 73 and 72 respectively. Within the 2019 calendar year, the New South Wales Police Force issued 91 infringements and 127 charges. It should be noted that one charge can be for multiple offences. The New South Wales Police Force has been supportive of changes to increase penalties and in creating new offences to be able to combat these abhorrent crimes. The New South Wales Police Force has appreciated the invitation to work with the Department of Primary Industries, the RSPCA and Animal Welfare League on these matters. It is not the belief of the New South Wales Police Force that they should take on animal cruelty as the sole law enforcement body. This is primarily because police do not have the expertise in either animal welfare matters nor the use of animals in primary production. My team, for example, relies heavily on the RSPCA and the Animal Welfare League in providing industry, understanding and subject matter expertise in what is good, bad or illegal in terms of animal husbandry. The New South Wales Police Force cannot provide the Committee with the historic context of why animal cruelty matters have historically had joint powers with other agencies. However, the position of the New South Wales Police Force that a collaborative relationships with the RSPCA and Animal Welfare League are invaluable to investigate these crimes. Specialties such as ecological conservation, game hunting, animal husbandry and primary food production are not within the scope of training of police officers, and I don't think that people would expect us to be so. Therefore, as police, we rely on the expertise of the other authorised enforcement agencies under POCTA. The New South Wales Police Force is committed to ensuring that any form of animal cruelty is not neglected. The police work very closely with the RSPCA and Animal Welfare League to make sure that animal cruelty cases are thoroughly investigated and prosecuted. We also currently work closely with the DPI to better ensure penalties for animal cruelty reflect community expectations. My team, the Rural Crime Prevention Team, remain highly committed to animal welfare issues as we are with any other rural crime matters. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Would anybody else like to make a? Mr. Scott Hansen.
Thank you, Chair. And conscious of time and conscious that you've already got our submission in front of you, so I might just keep it very brief and say animal welfare in this state is governed under 4 pieces of legislation: Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, which will be abbreviated to POCTA for most of the next hour and, well, probably 2 days for you actually. The Exhibited Animals Protection Act, Exhibited Animals and Animals in Research Act, as well as the Crime Act. So those 4 pieces of legislation are the key tools that we have at our disposal with regards to protecting animal welfare in the state. From a government perspective, that's not to dismiss the numerous industry-led initiatives that are in place, whether they be quality assurance schemes or certification schemes that are also designed to assist in the prevention or protection of animal welfare in the state. We have 4 bodies that are responsible for the oversight or the delivery of compliance. New South Wales Police, who you've already heard from, obviously RSPCA, Animal Welfare League, the Greyhound Integrity Welfare Commission, and so that acronym's going to get me in trouble all the time, the Greyhound Welfare and Integrity Commission, and obviously New South Wales DPI with regards to exhibited animals and animals in research. So that framework of those 4 pieces of legislation and that group of compliance and enforcement agencies are the tools at the disposal of the New South Wales people and via Parliament and their laws in enforcing and protecting animal welfare within the state. The government's obviously made it clear that it believes that the pieces of legislation are probably ripe to be reviewed and for a reform in the space around the legislation pieces that cover everything from POCTA through to exhibited animals, animals in research. We've been working behind the scenes to prepare and get ready for what will be a quite substantive piece of reform in this space, dealing with everything from the compliance arrangements all the way through to the legislative framework that underpins animal welfare. Obviously, with the way in which this year has started, when we press the button on the reform process or the review and reform process for legislation will be largely determined by when do we think communities will be able to turn their attention back to be able to providing meaningful input and having a meaningful discussion with us on that front once they recover from whether it be drought, fires or flood that they're currently dealing with.
Okay, thank you very much. Would anybody else like to make an initial statement?
Mr. Chair.
Yes,
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Secor.
Mr. Hansen, the announcement that you just made that the government is considering a major review or major reform, is that across all animal welfare issues? When you gave the indication that it was going to be a major review, can you tell us a bit about that? Because that's news to me.
So I don't know if it's news to everyone here because it's obviously been mentioned before that the government has a desire to review the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. That's an act that's over 40 years old now, and there's been quite a bit of discussion amongst industry, amongst community and with our compliance agencies around what steps would we take to modernise the Act. What would we look to do to bring the Act forward to continue to reflect better both the community's expectations around animal welfare as well as reflect modern knowledge and practices and technologies. So it is intended to be broad-ranging, similar to the reforms that were done with the Biosecurity Act a number of years ago, which looked to modernise that piece of legislation, bring together many other acts that provided a bit of a piecemeal approach on biosecurity to try to do the same with regards to animal welfare.
Now, I noticed from your submission that there were it's quite customary for people who make a submission to a government inquiry or parliamentary inquiry to make some recommendations. Now, I noticed that there are no recommendations in your submission. So, why were there no recommendations? I mean, are you happy with the status quo? Because it just sort of stated what the government is doing at the moment. Why were there no recommendations?
Well, I guess we see this as an opportunity to hear firstly from the wide range of participants who are either appearing or making submissions and making recommendations for this committee to consider those recommendations and the information that's presented before it, and that the outcomes from the recommendations from this committee will obviously then be considered by government in terms of their steps forward. Recommendations that we might have with regards to amendment to pieces of legislation that are within our control, we have other pathways for progressing through, not necessarily just relying on inquiries or committees to be able to do so.
Okay, well do you find having four bodies, police, RSPCA, Animal Welfare League, Greyhound Integrity, do you find that having four bodies investigating or examining animal cruelty is a hindrance or a help to your body?
So I'd say we haven't known anything different for a long time, so it's what we have been working with, and therefore it's been the relationships that have established over long periods of time that have helped make it work and put in place both the relationships, the memorandums of understanding, the operational procedures. It's not a unique situation either for the combination of government agencies, authorised charity organisations to come together with police forcing to actually provide the compliance framework for animal welfare. It's in fact, various iterations of this are what's in place across the whole Commonwealth. Each group brings a specialty and a skill set to the table that is unique and at times incredibly valuable to our operations.
Of the four bodies, which one would your organisation interface the most with? Is it police, RSPCA, Animal Welfare League, or Greyhound Integrity? Which one would you have the most interaction with?
So that'll depend on a number of factors, but from my perspective, and others might want to reflect differently, but from my perspective, it's New South Wales Police and RSPCA.
New South Wales Police.
And that's largely due to the significant volume of activities they both carry out and the resources they have at their disposal in terms of carrying that out.
Mr. Whiteside, in your opening statement, you said there were 1,001 incidents in the 2019 calendar year.
That's right.
Now, is that an increase or decrease? What's the trending on animal cruelty incidents in New South Wales brought to New South Wales Police attention? Is it increasing or decreasing, stabilising?
It's consistent with those figures for the last 3 years, I understand. Yeah.
And half involving dogs. So
Yes,
is
that's right,
that
544.
family pets or greyhounds? What are you referring to when you refer to
I can't
dogs?
give you that breakdown, I'm sorry.
Okay.
That would include all of the above, I would suggest.
Also, now, when you say incidents, are these reports or these are actually matters that come to, I guess, criminal charges?
They're matters that are reported to police
Yep.
and that may result in criminal charges, infringements or referral to the other agencies.
Right. Okay. Okay.
Or no action also.
No action. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Veach,
I just want to,
and then we'll go to
Mr. Hansen, can you just, I guess, the scope of the review of the legislation that you're talking about, those pieces of legislation, what is the timeframe? I know you in your opening statement you said it's sort of been bumped back a bit because of the catastrophic summer we've all had to endure, but so the first part of this is a review. When do you expect that review would start and potentially be completed?
So I think the government has made a commitment around to introducing new legislation in 2021.
Yep.
So this is all part of the announcement they made around the Animal Welfare Action Plan, which, you know, a key plank in that is the policy and legislative framework underpinning animal welfare. So a commitment to introduce legislative reforms in 2021 is the timeframe that's been set.
Okay, you worked to that, and I'm not going to say you're giving a guarantee or an undertaking, but the information obtained from this committee will inform the government's decisions around that.
So I'm sure the government will consider all the recommendations that come out of this, and
I'm just being cheeky.
but happy to accommodate it. You know, we actually have already gone through a lot of the submissions to look for, are we picking up all the issues when we go out there to talk about? How can we use the material that's been provided, including the evidence that gets provided over the next 2 days? It is a significant opportunity for us to harness that and to harvest it for the purposes of then setting up the platform for the discussions when we go back out.
Yep.
It'll give us the opportunity to say, okay, so have we captured everything we need to? Who's interested in what, talking about what pieces, and therefore how do we ensure that we tailor the communications, the discussions? So we actually are really looking forward. We've already harvested a lot of material and done a lot of cross-checking with issues that we see out of the written submissions. We're looking forward to following the inquiry over the next 2 days, because it does all help us coalesce a whole lot of information from a whole lot of interested stakeholders who we know we would be needing to go out and talk to anyway.
Yep.
With regards to potential reform.
Okay, so I'm off the time now.
Ms. Hurst.
Mr. Hansen, just in regards, I guess, a little bit more in depth with that reform, both the RSPCA and the Animal Welfare League said in their submissions that they would highly benefit from more funding from the government. Does the government have any response to that, or do you have any thoughts in regards to additional funding?
So I guess the amount of money we give to RSPCA and Animal Welfare League, and I'll let budget issues for New South Wales Police, I'm sure Mr. Whiteside can comment on. But the amount that we pass on as via a grant to those organisations, it has been static for a while. Wherever RSPCA or Animal Welfare League have come to us and asked or had an issue around resourcing, so just recently, for example, we've, off the back of drought, we've seen significant increase in stock welfare panels, so a significant increase in the need for interventions on animal welfare around the country, around the state at least, sorry. And in response to that, we've actually increased funding to both RSPCA and Animal Welfare League.
Do you know by how much?
I do. I think it's 650. I'll just check for confirmation from someone either side of me for a second. But it's allowed RSPCA to put on, for example, another 5 inspectors, Animal Welfare League to put on another 1 inspector. And so I like to think that we have a relationship with the 2 authorised charitable organisations that when they do come to us and say that there's a restriction or some concerns around resourcing, that we're able to work with them to accommodate and to adjust.
Outside of sort of that resourcing, one thing that's obviously come up with some of the submissions here is the fact that the RSPCA and the Animal Welfare League specifically still rely on hugely, for most of their funding, from donations. Do you know of any other law enforcement body in Australia that is dependent on donations to be able to enforce criminal law?
So, as I said, I don't think the situation of having RSPCA and a charitable organisation delivering compliance on animal welfare is unique to New South Wales. I think.
So there are other bodies that enforce criminal law that are charities, or is it just animal welfare that's enforced by a charity?
So I couldn't comment outside of the scope of our areas of compliance. But I do know within our areas of compliance, when you look across our other jurisdictions or the other jurisdictions across the country, I think with the exception of the Northern Territory, RSPCA play a compliance role in every other state. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that in every other state, therefore, it is that combination of both charity and government funding that is mixed in the...
But you're not sure if there's other criminal legislation that's enforced by charities?
Well, there's certainly not in our compliance space, but I couldn't comment broader in terms of compliance areas.
So could I just give a follow-up question there? So if the RSPCA is saying that the total RSPCA New South Wales Inspectorate cost is $6,233,000 in the last financial year, and the government has given them $650 to the Inspectorate, are you aware of any other criminal legislation that is administered and investigated and prosecuted by an authority for which 98% relies on public donations?
You already answered that question.
Well, within our areas...
$50 to 70 million, yes.
Yeah.
$1,000, not dollars.
Yeah. But the percentages...
Same thing.
So, as I said, within our compliance space within New South Wales, no. But as I said, it's not a unique situation in the animal welfare space across the country. All states and jurisdictions, with the exception of Northern Territory, utilise the services and the support of RSPCA in provision, in delivery of compliance enforcement actions. So I should also point out, so there's an annual grant that we make and we pass through, but then there's also other funding that is provided to the charity organisation outside of that.
But that's only in relation to shelters and buildings and things that the RSPCA or the Animal Welfare League want to acquire. But in terms of inspectorate and enforcement...
That's right, but even our grants are not they're not a fee for service to RSPCA or Animal Welfare League. They're a grant that are passed through as an annual grant to RSPCA and Animal Welfare League. The service of providing their inspectorate costs is significantly different than the grant amount that we pass through, and also significantly different from the grant amount that the New South Government passes through for other purposes for those charities as well. So, for example, last year, the government provided $12 million to RSPCA for facilities and for infrastructure. Now, that's money that would otherwise be funded by donations and revenues. So I guess, we're keen to hear out of the presentations that you get from both Animal Welfare League and RSPCA today about what their forward views are around funding. As I said, the funding grant that we provide as a pass-through has been static for quite some time. It's money that we get provided to provide across. We recognise the fact that, with, for example, RSPCA, the $424,000 in annual grant that we provide them is only a small piece compared to the between $5.5 and $6 million worth of inspectorate costs that they bear. That is how the arrangements have worked to date. These are the kind of subjects that we're keen to discuss and keen to have fleshed out both through this hearing and also the reform discussions.
Does the government have any sort of view around, there was some submissions, I think you may have seen, that there was concern about the idea that criminal legislation would have to be fundraised, predominantly the money to actually uphold that criminal legislation would have to be fundraised from the public. Does the government have any concern that, it requires that fundraising? And also, if the RSPCA, for whatever reason, at some point wasn't able to fundraise that $6 million, is there some kind of contingency plan with the government to be able to help cover those costs if that situation was to occur?
Yeah. So look, I think our key focus is about ensuring that there's a trained, capable service there to provide the enforcement of the animal welfare laws within the state. As I've indicated, when we do have a request, so when RSPCA have come forward and said, over and above what we have as business as usual, we see an increasing need in these areas. So, for example, in this case, about increasing pressure with drought around providing services.
So if the RSPCA said, actually, we feel that the entire enforcement agency should be covered by the government instead of fundraised, would the government then come to the table and say, okay, we would cover all costs for upholding that criminal legislation?
So I can't speak as to what the government's response to request was. What I can say is RSPCA has approached us with regards to additional funding required to accommodate increased pressure with drought. And we have responded with, I said 650, it's actually $620,000, 500,000 to RSPCA and 120,000 to Animal Welfare League, which, as I said, is just provided additional five and
Ms.
additional
Hurst,
one.
do you mind if I reword your question?
Mm-hmm.
If the RSPCA and Animal Welfare League were unable to provide investigation, were unable to assist, would DPI and New South Wales Police be able to undertake investigations?
So the immediate answer is New South Wales Police definitely, already authorised officers with regards to prevention of cruelty to animal act.
Yep.
DPI currently has no officers that are authorised under POCTA, but that's a very simple process for the Minister to undertake in terms of authorising officers, and so there is that opportunity for scaling. However, having said that, it's not just the number of people, it's also their facilities, their location, their infrastructure that comes behind it. So if they were to turn around tomorrow and not be able to deliver, it would leave a hole in the capability to deliver services as per today. But there would be solutions and pathways forward. That would just probably take time.
Thank you, Ms. Hurst. Sorry about that.
Sorry, Mr. Hansen, how are those funding figures calculated? Surely you don't just throw a number up in the air and see what sticks. Like, is it based on a staffing ratio? How is it worked? How did DPI come to the figure of 424,000 for RSPCA and 75k for Animal Welfare League? Like, is there a formula that's used?
No, there's no formula unless you calculate the formula as being last year's amount given to us by Treasury, being this year's amount given to us by Treasury to pass through as a grant to RSPCA and Animal Welfare League. As I said, it's not a fee-for-service grant, so it's not actually tied to this number of inspectors, this number of inspections, this number of compliance. It is literally a grant that is made across to the two charitable organisations. But there is no formula, and I must admit I've asked for any insight from people who go back beyond my period to work out what was the original calculation piece, and I'm still trying to work that out. So maybe RSPCA might be able to help you with how that number was originally calculated.
So, Mr. Hansen, the former Minister for Primary Industries, Niall Blair, stated in the House that the government wants to keep animal welfare at arm's length. And really, isn't this whole giving a small amount, such as 420,000, whatever it is, per annum, isn't it really just part of keeping the RSPCA and the Animal Welfare League kind of crippled and lame and incapable of really administering the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act?
So I'd first of all contend that RSPCA is anything but the description you just gave them in terms of their capacity and capability to enforce animal welfare in the state. If we thought that they were incapable, crippled, lame, then there would obviously be interventions that we would need to take. However, we don't believe to be that the case. Happy for you to progress that line of questioning with RSPCA in terms of how they feel about their capacity to do the job that's required of them. That being said, so the grant money that we provide them as a grant that goes through DPI to RSPCA is equally, alongside grant money that other agencies within the government provide them, such as the $12 million for infrastructure last year, that enables a funding pool of both the donations that are made to them, the revenues that they generate, and the grants from government to enable them to provide a range of services that all three of those funding sources are obviously aware of being activities of RSPCA. So we obviously are aware of their compliance and enforcement activities. Donors are obviously aware of their compliance and enforcement activities, and their commercial revenues are obviously all channelled through for ensuring an underpinning financial stability for the organisation to do the work that it sells itself and its brand upon being able to do. But I come back to, if there was, the end outcome for government is about the proper and capable enforcing of the three key pieces of legislation, being POCTA, exhibited animals, animals in research, as well as the Crimes Act. We have not only the New South Wales Police Force, but the two charitable organisations of RSPCA and Animal Welfare League, who come together to deliver that service in this state in much the same way as they come together in other states and jurisdictions to deliver a similar service.
Mr. Benazia?
Are there KPIs tied to these grants from DPI? Do you set key performance indicators when you give these grants?
So not key performance indicators, but there are responsibilities spelt out under both the legislation in terms of the reporting that's required, as well as in MOUs that we have both with RSPCA and Animal Welfare League, spells out our expectations about how they go about doing the job and how they report the progress against the job.
Are you able to provide the committee copies of those MOUs?
Yeah. Can I
obviously,
I just want to follow on from
just
you.
In terms of, wipe out anything that concerns in terms of privacy, but it would be good to find out exactly what those contain.
Mr. Hansen, can I just, so essentially this is a block grant. It's sort of a block grant type of funding. You're the conduit. You don't actually determine the amount. It's actually Treasury pays, sort of goes through DPI to the ACOs, essentially.
Yeah, so it's an annual grant that's made to those two charitable organisations.
Yeah, that's right. And so I guess then, so the MOU, what role does the MOU play in determining what is the annual block grant amount? What does it play? No role.
No, it plays no role.
So the funding's not attached to the MOU. It's not a performance-based funding. It's essentially just a block amount of funding provided on an annual basis to the ACOs to assist in their operation.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So what the MOUs do is give detailed expectations and coverage for the requirements that the two organisations have in being authorised as authorised charitable organisations under the POCTA Act. So that Act places obligations on them in terms of what they do, how they go about doing it. The MOUs give effect to how they need to be working in concert with each other and with us in delivering against their obligations under the Act.
Sorry,
Ms. Boyd?
Ms. Boyd, sorry.
Would it be fair to say that sort of historically looking at the funding model, the government has put in a certain amount that relies on a certain amount of donations to keep the status quo? So for the RSPCA, if at the moment it's looking at 95% of its funding comes from donations and 5% from government, I suspect from a government perspective it doesn't make sense to give them more than what they need to carry on a status quo basis. But isn't that hugely risky in terms of We've already heard that the RSPCA is a source of expertise that other agencies don't have. If they get to a point where they're unable to get the same amount of donations, has the department thought about ensuring that it would ratchet up its contribution to ensure that they could continue?
No. So, yes, in that we have probably the largest compliance force on the ground is the New South Wales Police Force, and there's an immediate option for us in terms of filling gaps. But as you've heard, expertise is one of the key features that we need to add into this mix, and that's where we also have compliance officers that have expertise in this space that could be turned on under POCTA to be able to fill gaps as well. The relationship and the funding mix has been a long-standing one, and as we've sort of covered, it's historical in terms of where it's come from. We do expect that this subject around compliance and enforcement and what would modern legislation look like to sort of both make more efficient the resources of the organisations in terms of delivering compliance, as well as have we got the right settings in place in terms of how we deliver on that as part of the Animal Welfare Action Plan and the reform process that's been considered.
Would it, I guess, comparing this situation to other types of crimes, and we have crimes against animal cruelty in various provisions. If we would have a similar situation for any other type of crime, so imagine anything from child abuse, the idea that we would rely on an external charity to get donations in order to have the expertise to bring those issues to light and to have them prosecuted would be unacceptable to the community. And yet we allow it for animal cruelty. And I understand it might be historical as to why we have done that, but is the department thinking about what that looks like in the future?
So I guess the degree of comfort that the community can take is the fact that should those arrangements with the authorised charitable organisations, were they ever to stop on a particular day because of inability of the charities to deliver, we have, again, the New South Wales Police Force as the base rock of compliance activity for this crime and for the crimes under this legislation. So we have the New South Wales Police Force as the go-to to be able to ensure that the community still has a well-resourced and well-established authority in this space.
Wouldn't it be...
We
also then have...
But Mr Hansen, that is not the case. The community does not believe that the... I mean, the police say it themselves, don't they, Mr Whiteside? Often they'll get a call and they say, well, we need to refer that to the RSPCA. I mean, if what you're saying is true, that we believe that the police have the fundamental overarching responsibility and power under POCTA, then we wouldn't need to be here.
But I'd say that at the moment they do have the capacity because they do have a well-resourced and well-trained charitable organisation sitting alongside them with technical expertise that they can refer to. If that doesn't exist, then obviously that's not an option for them. Yes. And, they adjust accordingly, as would we with our compliance officers with expertise. There are responses, I guess, available to the government through both New South Wales DPI and through New South Wales Police to adjust to a future scenario that doesn't involve charity organisations.
Mr Whiteside, what do you say to that? What Mr Hansen has said about the police?
Our relationship with the RSPCA is crucial in terms of our addressing animal cruelty. In terms of the expertise that it brings to the table, yes, we have got the capability to investigate crimes, and right from our initial training at the academy, where it be, where the police are skilled with, the Crimes Act, LEPRA, and investigation techniques. Animal cruelty is not unlike, other than non-charitable, the charitable organisations, is not unlike other crimes that we investigate. We also rely heavily on other agencies to assist us with that, like we do the local land services, the DPI in terms of in child abuse with medical practitioners and the like.
But not charities.
Yeah, but that's what I said. I said that, but not charities, and we don't.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah. Mr. Secord? Thank you.
Mr. Detective Inspector Whiteside, take us through what happens when someone calls up to say, I think one of my neighbors is maltreating his pets, his animals. Take us through what happens when a call like that comes in. Where does it go to? How is it triaged, so to speak? Can you take us through the procedures?
It's the same as any other crime or any other incidents in general speaking terms that we receive, whether it be the front counter from a call centre like a police assistance line. That's assessed based upon the seriousness or the need to act immediately, and based upon, and also assessed based upon the available evidence that's relayed to us. So is that in an admissible form? Have we other information or intelligence to support that or otherwise? And then based upon the current workload in that area, it's assessed in terms of a response.
Okay, so how do cases get to the RSPCA or to the animal welfare? How do they self-initiate? How does that occur? I'm trying to get sort of a demarcation, or is there an overlap? How does that occur?
For instance, with the RSPCA and just on open source documents, last year, in comparison to the police, our reports were, as I said, 1,001, I think, from memory. Yep. And they had over 15,000. They've got a dedicated call line for that purpose that people ring and can report online for animal cruelty to the RSPCA. We've got various different ways of the report to police, and ideally, the best way is to front up your local police station and have that one-on-one conversation and assess that information and evidence to act.
Do you find that there's duplication? That you're working on a case, RSPCA and animal welfare are working on a case at the same time?
That's highly possible, and it has happened, but that's negated pretty quickly, because especially in terms of my team, I speak to my team, we generally deal with large animals. We'll make that phone call to the RSPCA in terms of a response at the earliest opportunity to assess what level of response is required and whether they will go instead of us because we've got other competing demands, and likewise. Those calls go flow back the other way also from the Animal Welfare League and RSPCA to us.
So do you look at their briefs of evidence and things like that, or is it a complete silo separate to you?
They have got their own prosecuting capability, and however, we have got an MOU between the two of us that we share information in terms of matters before the court. And like I've said before, it works, in my opinion, works really, really well, that we rely on that expertise, and likewise. For instance, now in terms of on top of the reporting, to increase that capability of taking that report, we use the RSPCA inspectors to assist in training in terms of first responding police, and they've travelled around in the last 12 months a number of local area commands and police districts to provide that training. As I speak now, this week, I'm running a rural crime workshop in Lismore, where there's an inspector there that is speaking to the technicalities and the evidence and information in respect to investigating animal cruelty matters, which is crucial because the people that are before that course or that workshop are first responding police that are one-man stations that removes that unknown in terms of in terms of any crime that you're unsure with on how to go about it. But if you break down most crimes, they're quite simple in terms of the approach and the report and the investigation and evidence you have to obtain to get the matter before the court. Where this matter is different is it's quite special and it's quite emotive in terms of the animal. So there is a significant amount of priority that puts on those matters when we can.
So just in terms of, sorry, I'll just ask a question, then I'll go to Amato and then come back. Just as you said that the police seeks advice and assistance from resources within government departments like the DPI, or all sorts of authorities or sources, could it not be the case that the police could also source the resource of the RSPCA, even if it's not the primary enforcement agency? It still would be able to be a resource to the police if it were the police that was actually having the overarching responsibility for animal protection.
We could speak to a number of RSPCA. We could also continue to speak to them. Yes. However, the fact that they have a enforcement and prosecuting capability is beneficial for us, the New South Wales Police, also to address further matters and other diverse crimes also.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Amato?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Hansen. Please, thank everyone for coming here today. In regards to the RSPCA and the Animal Welfare League, apart from the grants and donations that they get, what happens to the internal revenue raising? If they adopt out an animal and you want to go and adopt an animal, there's obviously a fee to be paid. Or if you get animals desexed, you don't know what those revenue raising amounts are?
We could find them out, but given the fact that you have them appearing as witnesses later, probably a good question for them in terms of their different business streams and the
Yeah, I
revenues
was just
out of
looking
those.
like, obviously they do desexing, they do,
Yeah.
rehaming, and obviously there's a fee associated with that. I just wondered what the fee was, but I will ask them that question there.
Sorry, if I may, those figures are published annually by regulation in the RSPCA financial statement, all the details, all that information on an annual basis.
No, thank you for that, I appreciate it.
I might just add, if I can, I mean, there are other services that they also provide that
yes.
aren't commercial services as well. And probably at this point in time, worthwhile putting on record our thanks to both Animal Welfare League, who turned up in a number of fire grounds just recently with their brand new big mobile operating theatres that they have, the big semis that pull into town that enable mobile operations, housing of animals that have been burnt or injured and treating them.
Yeah, they've done remarkable work during the bushfires.
You know, that service, the service of RSPCA and Animal Welfare League across the state over the last 190 days in manning evacuation centres and helping both our staff, Mr Whiteside's staff and LLS staff in looking after animals that are brought into evacuation centres out of the fires. I mean, you know, even from the northern fire zone, we still have over 500 animals in our care that just have nowhere to return to at this point in time. You know, we rely on the partnership between our staff, the local community, RSPCA and Animal Welfare League and all those. Now, I'm not sure if they're captured in their commercial activity, because it's certainly not commercial activity. It's not required under POCTA. It's just part of the service that they provide in caring for animals.
So I've just got a...
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I've just got a follow-up question from what we were talking about before about the systems with Mr Whiteside in regards to the communication between the Animal Welfare League and the police. And it's been indicated to me that the RSPCA don't have access to the COPS system and the COPS don't have access to the RSPCA's system either. So it actually requires them to contact and call each other. In Canada, there was a report on what was the equivalent to the RSPCA in Canada. And one of the big issues was animal cruelty investigators coming under personal risk when there was only one RSPCA investigator in an area and entering a situation that was potentially dangerous. And to sort of put on my old hat as a psychologist, we know that the research shows that people who are violent towards animals are very regularly violent towards humans. Now, I understand the RSPCA often call the police if they think that that might be the case and they attend with a police officer. But have you heard of situations where obviously they wouldn't always have that information available to them, where RSPCA officers could be at risk where they're attending, or Animal Welfare League officers at risk where they're attending on their own, or do you think that that's a potential risk?
I can't speak to what has happened in terms of the RSPCA. They may have encountered those situations, but the relationship, especially from the last 2 years from the formation of my team, we've enhanced our relationship with the RSPCA and AWL to address that very thing. And thank you for your question. And if I could speak to stock welfare panels in particular, as well as it's a similar basis of other matters, other crimes or other incidents where we're called to. The assessment of a threat or issues and violence, as you pointed out, is quite it crosses a number of crime categories, and that is quite indicative into a lot of research in terms of animals being abused linked to other crimes. The MOU between the RSPCA and the New South Wales Police Force outlines our role in particular in respect to assessing those threats and providing that information to them. There may have been cases when they haven't called us, and as I said, I can't speak to those. For an example, with Mr Hansen has alluded to it, there's been a significant increase in stock welfare panels. Historically, there was, on average, I would say at a guess, we've got 4 or 5 a year, but at times it has increased significantly, which in the past, our rural crime investigators have had a major role in terms of the processing of those operations to the point now, and our role is primarily a breach of the peace and reducing that risk. And that will be no different to us conducting a search warrant where we go through a vigorous risk assessment process to mitigate that risk. And there are also
And
some...
that's been, you're teaching that to the inspectorates at RSPCA and Animal Welfare League? Is that what?
When you say teaching it, we do the risk assessment because, as you alluded to, we've got greater holdings in terms of intelligence and history because it crosses a number of crime categories, whether it be drugs, outlaw motorcycle links, or all the like. And I just speak to those, not saying there are those threats, but we assess those on basis. Because the reality is we're going onto a property where a landholder or a farmer is in significant mental health issues to start with. There are firearms potentially on the property, and we're going with the lead agency in these instances, RSPCA, and the processes with the DPI, LLS, etc., to ultimately potentially remove those animals. It's a significant mental health. So whatever risk or whatever issues there are there at that time are multiplied considerably because of the presence not only of police but enforcement agencies, and we're very mindful of that, of doing that better. And so we've put a lot of significant resources and communication with the heads of RSPCA, DPI and LLS in addressing those. And to answer your question in closing, yes, we're very, very mindful of that, and we, at every opportunity, through our training and conversations with the RSPCA and other agencies that may have to go onto a property, they do speak to us, and primarily we're there for a breach of the peace. But we may not go to every incident, however, we'll have input where it's justified.
Mr. Farraway, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, Mr. Hansen, do you have anything to add to that in regards to situations where the RSPCA or the Animal Welfare League may not know if they're going into a dangerous situation, they may not have contacted the police, particularly, domestic violence situations and things like that, where you've got one RSPCA officer to cover a very large remote or rural area?
Only that it's probably a good question to ask of both organisations with regards to their standard operating procedures. We do know that they have copied many of the standard operating procedures from New South Wales Police in terms of compliance activities, evidence, briefs and so forth. So probably one to address to both those. I know certainly across our compliance groups, we require 2 people to be present at all times. That's not only for personal safety but also for evidence collection.
Sorry, for the RSPCA?
No, across the rest of our compliance activities across DPI.
Okay.
So I can't comment on what the operating procedures are for RSPCA or Animal Welfare League, but it wouldn't be unusual to have a situation where they do require 2 for compliance activities, but something to ask them.
Thank you. Mr. Farraway.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Hansen, I just wanted to go back to the Animal Welfare Action Plan. Obviously, it needs to be very outcomes focused. I was just wondering if you could touch on what do you want to achieve out of that, or what are some of the goals that are in that plan that you think the department and government need to achieve through that plan, I suppose?
So thanks for the question. There was actually 6 goals that got outlined by the Minister when the plan was outlined. We've spent a lot of time here talking about the modernising policy and legislation framework, implementing companion animal breeding practice reforms, improving effectiveness of compliance and enforcement efforts, which is another key topic obviously for this committee, ensuring sound research and scientific practices are used to develop policy and legislation, engaging with key stakeholders and ensuring all views are respected and considered in developing policy and legislation, and investing in our systems and processes to make sure we have best in class.
So part of the action plan is the Animal Welfare Advisory Council. Is that in place now, or is that something that's being introduced under the plan?
That's in place now.
Yep.
It'd be fair to say that under those 6 headings, in a couple of those areas, come to how do you actually put this all together in a more coherent fashion, more coherent way. So at the moment, you've got the 4 pieces of legislation, but let's put Crimes Act off to one side for a moment. You've got 3 specific animal welfare pieces of legislation. Under those pieces of legislation, you obviously have the regulations that then sit. Under the regulations, you have various codes, and in some cases they are national standards and guidelines. In other cases, they are state-based codes. And they have then various consultative groups, committees, bodies that provide advice on the specific activities within those codes, within those regulations. I think everyone agrees that there could be a much simpler way in which we bring all this together. A lot of what we find ourselves needing to address is leaning on a link between an underpinning piece of legislative power out through some regulation, back to some code that's in development, through to some advisory body, and then to compliance officers in the field. I think a key piece of this reform is how do we make this a more modern piece of legislation that is simpler for everyone to understand what needs to be delivered, how it needs to be delivered, and what the expectations of both community and government are in terms of the legislative framework.
So you see, you would see this, and the expectation would be that the advisory council would work very closely to advance, progress the 6 goals, obviously under these reforms or under the Welfare Action Plan.
They'll certainly be a key party in the consultation and helping frame up and providing advice to the Minister with regards to the reforms. But there are so many heavily interested parties in these reforms that there will be numerous sources of advice and information being fed through. Obviously, the advisory committee will be one, but we expect there'll be numerous groups providing advice and helping shepherd through how do we make the most of this, what is almost a once-in-a-generational opportunity to reform these pieces of legislation.
The advisory council now, when does it expire, I suppose, the term, if you're saying it's in place now?
So we've just reviewed the council structure. So that's, at the moment, actually, we have an expression of interest out for membership to a reinvigorated council, which will be very scientific, expert-based. So that's the intent with the structure moving forward, and then being able to have reference groups on a needs basis come in under that council for specific issues that are related to different animal types.
How many members or participants are there on the council?
It's not set at the moment, but it will probably be about 7 members with the chair included.
Yeah, for a job.
Mr. Benazia.
Thank you, Chair. Just going back to the stock welfare panels, your evidence that you've given sort of implies that they're not permanent panels, that they sort of pop up when they need. Is that the case?
That's correct.
Okay.
And so a stock welfare panel is established to deal with a specific incident in a specific location. Yep. To be able to do that, we rely on assistance from local community members via New South Wales Farmers Association, LLS, our staff, police, RSPCA, so quite often very localised. They know the community, they know how to deal with individuals. What we do is we stand them up, they deliver their outcomes. We don't automatically close them down once the case is closed. We leave them in abeyance, but still they're on our books as a stock welfare panel, should we have to revisit or should we have to deal with a recurrent or repeat offence.
Yeah, and the submission sort of states that the regulation states that the panels don't actually have to include a veterinary practitioner. It just says they may include, so it's not actually mandatory. Is there a view to maybe make it mandatory in the future as part of this review that you're going through?
Usually the LLS representative is a district veterinarian. Well, in every case so far we have had a vet on there, and the regulation provides for us to bring in a private vet if it's the case that the LLS vet person is not a vet.
Okay. There's been a lot of commentary on both sides of the fence from submissions, some saying that the RSPCA needs more powers in terms of what they can and can't do. And on the other side of the fence, some of them saying they need their wings clipped a little bit in terms of the powers that they have. So I just for clarity of the committee, what powers do they have in terms of entering premises, comparing it to police powers, because that's the parallel that's been drawn quite often. You know, do they have to abide by the same standards of evidence in terms of getting permission to go onto that land? Can you give us some clarity about?
So all of the inspectors under the Act have the powers that the Act provides them with. So they have powers of entry onto properties, If they suspect on reasonable grounds that there's a breach of the Act potentially occurring, they can enter houses if only in very specific situations, if there's a really urgent issue. Otherwise, like everyone else, they need to get a warrant to enter houses. So they have the powers of entry to examine animals and can then also look at providing care to certain animals, which does include seizing animals. It can be getting vet treatment or providing food or water to those animals. And in some cases, if it's in their best interest and if they're cruel to be kept alive, euthanasing them as well.
So when you run through the powers just further to that, so they have the power to enter land for the purposes of exercising their powers under Proctor, as just outlined.
And is that based on evidence that there is harm being done to animals, or it's just carte blanche permission to enter a property and find the evidence? Because there's been accusations that that's what they do. So I just, for the clarity of the committee,
They need to suspect on reasonable grounds that there's a breach of the Act or the regulation occurring for them to be able to enter, except in some cases where there are trades codes where they can enter without.
and do they need to record that suspicion anywhere or report that suspicion anywhere before they enter the property, or it's just in their head, I'm suspicious,
There's a number. I may answer that. There's a number of ways in which you can enter. Obviously, it has to have a certain threshold. You have to have a reason, belief that these animal cruelty matters are present or need to be addressed. You have to obviously, you just can't walk in. You have to tell them who you are, why you're there, and it's offence not to comply, and that's for the land. But you can also use consent, and generally you'd use consent to go onto a property or a search warrant. To make that enter. But in terms of inspectors, we've all got which we are in the Act, we've got the same powers that they have. I haven't heard of such things, but I think we need to be careful about what we've heard and what's actual fact. I just don't know. An example of where the legislation differs, the only one I can think of in the Act, is that we're exempt in terms, I want to say where the police are covered by in terms of body-worn devices on the property under the Surveillance Devices Act, whereby the RSPCA and AWL aren't. So that's something that, if we're looking for changes, ultimately that may be discussed down the track, but that's because we rely heavily on joint investigations, that evidence that they glean or they record, and as we know, the evidence you get from a photo or a video is much better than someone's recollection of what has taken place.
Is that also, are the police able to install hidden cameras and things like that to gather evidence where the RSPCA would never be able to get that, or is there a difference in that?
I can't speak to the RSPCA, but we would either do it through consent or through a warrant.
Yeah. And that, you're not sure if that's available to the RSPCA?
Hidden cameras? No. So.
Like surveillance through a warrant, are they able to apply for a warrant for surveillance?
So our experience has been when you get to a level of inquiry or investigation that requires that form of covert operation, all of our agencies tend to fall back and rely on the advice, the training, the expertise and the powers from New South Wales Police. So at that point in time we would normally lean into the powers and the expertise from New South Wales Police, therefore bypassing the requirement of other individual agencies to be able to obtain.
And you can't. It doesn't cover all offences. There's got to be a serious, certain level for an infringement offence.
We get a warrant. Yeah.
Mr. has one more question.
Yeah,
to Mr. Mason Cox.
One more. In the government submission, it talks about the ACOs having to be compliant with the Act in themselves. In that instance, the police would obviously be the principal investigator. So, as the principal investigator, in the last 3 years, has there been any instances of either of the ACOs breaching the Act, and what has been the result of those complaints and investigations?
I can't speak to those. I have no knowledge of it. I can take the question on notice, and probably something to be directed to the RSPCA. In essence, they will be aware of any complaints that have been directed towards them. I just can't speak to it. I'm sorry.
Sure.
And just for clarification, before I go to Mr. Mason Cox, is so as far as you're aware, and to be somewhere absolutely clear, is there any power that the police have under the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, or the Exhibited Animals Protection Act for that matter, which the RSPCA does not have?
The only one that springs to mind is that body-worn video capability.
Is another issue? Is it possible for the police to act on an anonymous complaint more so than what the RSPCA does?
We're bound by the same level of, I suppose, want a better word, reaction to what information that we have. It has to be assessed. Isolated, it's very difficult to investigate a matter on anonymous information.
But the police would not automatically dismiss an informant because they're not willing to give their details.
No, but there's different levels of response to you can do that. We definitely record what was told to us, and then depending if it's maybe coupled with other information, we would encourage that person obviously to come forward and give that name, because obviously that helps us with giving that evidence before the court, and it may support or otherwise the matter before the court.
Okay, thank you. Mr Mason Cox, sorry about the delay.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr Whiteside, if I might just start with you, just a couple of questions in relation to your opening statement.
Yes.
You mentioned that you were concerned or raised the concern about penalties being adequate and offences being adequate in relation to the current regime. Could you expand on that?
I think my outline from memory was that we're supportive of any opportunity to review the penalties and powers in respect to POCTA. There are a number of matters that can be addressed through that process, and I'm hopeful that they will come out of this process here today. But my opening comments were that I'm supportive of any changes that may come as a result of the opportunity.
Are there any issues you want to put your finger on that perhaps you've seen through your experience that should be perhaps addressed in that context?
I've touched on the body-worn video in terms of the RSPCA. In terms of Section 31 orders under POCTA, which is an exclusion or a non-possession of animals, ownership of animals order that can be implemented from the courts. I would like to see that at the moment any breach of that offence is a finable offence, about $3,000, which obviously I'd like to review the deterrent factor in the public interest in respect to that. There is difficulties in relation to investigating those matters in terms of checking on those that may be subject of orders, in terms of, you can't look through walls as to see if they've got animals, and we've got no right to just, we can knock on the door and ask them obviously, but to have something in place to have a system where we can check on those that are subject to those orders. In terms of the stock welfare panels, where it's there are situations that we're finding now that have become quite difficult in that that's under Section 24. And I want to say on the stock welfare panel, it's just not for those that aren't aware, it's not a matter of just standing up a stock welfare panel and then charging onto a property and seizing animals. It's a significant process you go through and has to be signed off by the Secretary.
Could you provide us details of that, just to put that all in context?
The stock welfare panel?
Yeah, just in terms of, not now, but just to the committee as a question on notice, just the detail, the process in order to set up.
Maybe best answered by the DPI. I can do that, but it's quite clear within the Act from the Section 24 through P through to Q.
Yeah.
In respect to that, currently there is a hinder provision if, because as I said before, I touched on it's quite emotive, these stock welfare panels, and become quite problematic in terms of operating within to carry out the order. Again, with landholders and friends and neighbours becoming quite emotive, coupled with media attention at times. There is a provision to deal with it under Section 18, I think it is from memory, of a hinder provision, which personally I don't like seeing used, because there's other ways we can resolve these matters without adding criminal charges to someone who's suffering under such circumstances, in terms of putting before the court for a hinder process. I would like to see.
What would be your suggestion in that regard?
I would like to see that there be provisions similar to that that are in LEPRA with crime scene powers, with the ability to exclude people from the property so that the function can be carried out. And the reason being is that some of the times these matters go over a period of days, and there may be firearms on the property that we may or may not know about, and the situation can escalate, so we have to go back into a further risk assessment the following day, and it becomes problematic. I'm not saying that someone should not be there independent or observing and be present. There's no issue with that. It's just when it becomes problematic, I'd rather see someone excluded as opposed to being prosecuted for that matter.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to pose a question to Mr. Christie. As part of investigations of animal cruelty and that, how many instances of biosecurity or food tampering would DPI be involved in investigating? Or am I directing it to you?
No, again, I think there's a number of those in both the biosecurity and food safety area, which...
Can you speak into the microphone, please?
Sorry.
You can turn it around.
Oh,
There are a number of biosecurity and food safety issues that we investigate, and if there are animal welfare issues involved in those things, we involve the RSPCA at the same time. I'd have to take on notice the actual number of both of those, but happy to do so.
I know this inquiry is about animal cruelty and that, but in fact, is DPI aware or has investigated incidents where so-called animal rights activists have contaminated or been involved in biosecurity issues?
Certainly when there are animal rights activists have been on the property, we work together with the police and the RSPCA to determine whether there's been biosecurity risks there. And we're certainly encouraging farmers and others to have biosecurity plans, so it's very clear to anybody who comes onto the property what's required to be done.
Okay. Just one last. Mr. Hansen, twice in your evidence today, you've referred to a review of the current regime, review, reform, modernizing the Act, and at one point you described it as a once-in-a-generation opportunity. So you can't just tantalize us like that. So what areas, you can't just simply say that you're looking at a once-in-a-generation review of the Act and then not say what you're looking at or what consideration is underway, because it would affect the deliberations of this committee.
So I certainly hope the deliberations of this committee provide us with some increased framework around the areas we should be making sure that we delve into and open up. As you'll find with most of the legislation, the moment you start to unpick one thread, it's got consequential impacts on others. So when I say significant reform, we mean significant reform. We don't think you can unpick one thread without having to look at all of the legislation. You know, right from the very start, the fact that the Act aims to prevent cruelty rather than enhance or increase welfare sets us off on almost an adversarial footing right from the very start. So we know from our close working relationships with a number of NGOs, with a number of industry groups, that everyone has been accumulating over many years areas and pieces that they see we could make improvements in, that we could enhance or we could adjust. Key part for us though is it's always about as much about the journey as the outcome, in terms of bringing all those groups with you, in terms of looking as to what are we trying to achieve. How do we go about best at doing that? What's the best combination of tools, both compliance tools available to us, scientific tools, and legislative tools available to achieve the outcome? I guess the easiest way would be to say, at the moment, we don't have an expectation or belief that anything is off the table. It's more everything is on the table.
Now, one last...
Sorry, just on that, would therefore, in this inquiry or revisiting the space, it's a generation experience. Will it be considered, as has come through many submissions, for there to be an independent officer of animal welfare? Will the department be looking at that issue?
Obviously, the structural arrangements for the delivery of the Act will be a key part of the deliberations of government in terms of how do you set this up to be delivered. And as I said, I don't think anything's off the table.
So it will be considered?
From what I understand.
Okay, my final question. I know one of the acts you referred to was the Exhibited Animals Protection Act.
Yes.
And I think from memory there are about 40 councils in Australia that have bans on exhibited animal circuses. What is the New South Wales DPI's response to, I guess, circuses that have exhibited animals, and is any work being done in this area? I guess exotic animals in circuses.
There's an inquiry.
So the Exhibit Animals Protection Act and the Animal Research Act are included in the reform piece.
Yep.
So the three bits of legislation across the board will be getting looked at. Under the Exhibit Animals Protection Act, we have standards, and there are standards particularly for circuses. So they are licensed and get audited. So those standards are specific to circuses as well as general standards. And I'm not sure whether you're aware there is an upcoming inquiry in regard to exotic animals in circuses, so we'll be considering that when that comes along.
I was throwing it out there to see what I would get.
So,
Mr. Banasiak.
Ms Robertson, does the Animal Welfare Advisory Committee still exist? It was around a few years ago, but seems to have sort of petered out.
So that's what we were speaking to before, with
Jobs
the
are up for sale.
advisory council. Yeah, so it's actually, there's an expression of interest out at the moment to have a look at membership for that and new members for that.
Okay.
That's underway at the moment.
The
Chair remains.
the government the government submission sort of goes through the stats of both the two ACOs, and Animal Welfare League sort of seems to pale in comparison in terms of the role that they play. Is that just a human capital issue from their end, or is it is it a case that the RSPCA have marketed themselves better as a charity and as I guess an inspectorate of animal welfare? I'm looking to see whether if they had more troops on the ground, would they be able to pick up some of the slack? Because it seems RSPCA are doing the lion's share of the work.
And good questions to ask Animal Welfare League when you see them later today. I think it's traditionally been a case of where have the resources been, therefore where can the footprint be, therefore how much activity can be undertaken by each of the two groups. That being said, you can see from the investment that Animal Welfare League has made into some of their infrastructure, some of their equipment, some of their footprint around the state in terms of where they are putting people now. They obviously have plans about what further things they can be doing, and I'm sure that they'll be able to talk further to you about it when they're here.
Could I just, when there's a problem with the conduct, for example, of the police force, if somebody has a concern, there's a formal system that they can make a complaint through, such as the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission. Does the government have any sort of response in regards to the criticisms that we've received that the RSPCA and the Animal Welfare League are subject to far less scrutiny? Like they're not subject to a GIPA, they don't have to appear at budget estimate hearings, they're not subject to administrative review and so on. You probably would have seen some of those criticisms in the submission, Mr. Hansen. Do you have any sort of thoughts or response around it?
Only that there's obviously an area that's ripe for recommendations from this committee and for the reform process to look at.
Do you know if that's on the agenda for the reform process?
So I go back to the comment. I don't know what's off the table for the reform process. Because at the moment we rely on RSPCA desire to comply with any GIPA requests that come through. There is no legal obligation on them to do so. I think
voluntary,
their evidence will be they voluntarily try to do that whenever they do get GIPA'd or get GIPA past them.
So just for clarification there, the RSPCA's submission states that they are required to respond to a GIPA in relation to the inspectorate because it's appointed by the government.
Yeah. So in terms of providing information that's required under the Act, yes. But in terms of the broader RSPCA receiving GIPAs and having to respond, no. And so we rely on their goodwill in that case. So I think that's an area that is open for looking at what is best practice for this space. What should we be looking for increased transparency and increased reporting? At the moment, it requires them to make reports at the end of years. Is that the right information being reported at that end of financial year in terms of provision to Parliament, tabling of reports there? Are we getting the right information? Is it coming in a timely enough fashion? All those pieces, I think, are well and truly open for consideration under the reform process.
Mr. Mason-Cox?
Yes, Mr. Whiteside, just again, in relation to the MOU you mentioned you have with the RSPCA, etc., Have you provided a copy of that to the committee? I didn't see it, but would you be able to provide a copy of that to the committee?
Take that question on notice, and I'll check with the legalities of that, but it's available, yes.
That'd be great. That'd be excellent. I was just also wondering, like, the relationship with the RSPCA, etc., seems to be pretty close, working relationship. Do you have sort of training that you do for them, or do they do training for you, your officers, in relation to animal welfare, use of inspection powers and the like?
As I outlined before, they have had travel to a lot of the police districts and police area commands in the last 12 months. I can't give a number on that, but I think there's 6 or 7. There's an open invitation to police area commands, and they have their educational component. They've been out to deliver those that educational package, mainly aimed at well, I don't say the lower, so in terms of first responders, issues in terms of responding to animal cruelty complaints, animal cruelty and domestic violence matters, but also, as I touched on there, we've got with the Rural Crime Prevention Team, which which was set up 2 years ago. We've become a predominant focus on rural crime issues, which also takes in obviously animal welfare issues, and now our team is increasing again. But to help us and to help us to address the rural crime and animal welfare issues throughout the state, as I touched on, we have the RSPCA with other external agencies come to our rural crime workshops, where they give a detailed overview of their role, the powers, etc., to enhance the capability of those first responders. And in the last 2 years, we've conducted, at a guess, around 20 of those workshops and trained approximately 400 first responding police, whether the local uniform officer in a one-man station in remote New South Wales, through to detectives and prosecutors to help us in that process.
Detective Whiteside, when you talk about rural crime, how much of it is actually investigation of animal cruelty versus stock theft? Things like that. When you use can we delve down a bit into that?
The definition of rural crime is an incident or a crime that impacts upon the function of the agricultural, pastoral and aquacultural industries.
Yep.
There is a bit of crossover in terms of the crimes we investigate, and traditionally people think that is just stock theft. However, it's not. It's illegal hunting and trespassing, which can cross into animal cruelty in terms of the methods of use to kill the animals. Mm-hmm. But also it can cover biosecurity issues, diesel theft, water theft, and you've probably seen recently in the media a significant amount of hay-related fodder frauds that have been investigated by our team. So it's quite. But in saying that, the Rural Crime Prevention Team do not do every rural crime. That's why we enhance the capabilities of the uniformed police and other police to respond to those crimes, which. And as you know, animal cruelty is just not, the complaints of animal cruelty is just not confined to the rural industries. And as I outlined in my opening statement, it's quite significant on companion animals, whether it be from attendants and domestic violence or other matters.
Now, for RSPCA and Animal Welfare League investigations, are there parts of the state where they don't have reach and it's your responsibility, or do they have reach for the entire state?
They cover the whole state, but obviously I think from open source documents they've got 32 inspectors, mm-hmm. So therefore we've got a much more significant number of that in terms of police officers that can enforce POCTA. So we do cover those areas, but likewise they do cover us also when we can't make that.
So we're starting to run short of time. I'm going to have a question, and then Mr. Benaziak, and then I think we'll have to close.
No, short of time.
Mr. Hansen, don't you, as DPI is revisiting this whole issue of animal protection under the various legislations, doesn't the DPI have a problem that they have to revisit? Let's say, unlike a department of, say, local government or the police, the DPI is also responsible, or also takes on as part of its responsibility is to support and uphold the interests of large animal use enterprises. And then if you are going to now this same department is now going to turn its mind and revisit animal protection, can you not see that this is going to present quite a serious problem for your department?
So I know there'll be those who see this as a conflict, but I think there's also a large body of evidence that says that this is actually complementary. You can't actually help progress agricultural industries without helping progress animal welfare outcomes. They just need to go hand in hand. They can't be separated. And I think if you look across all jurisdictions, you'll find that that's in fact the way it's been approached. And I think if you look across even as recent as the most recent Victorian parliamentary inquiry into animal welfare, I think last week their report again comes out and says that they've looked at this issue themselves with Ag Victoria and the animal welfare compliance and legislation within the state of Victoria, and they also see that it's a complementary, not conflict issue that needs to be addressed.
I think there'd be quite a few people who would
I'm
disagree.
sure there are.
Yeah, but is that question going to be looked at in this revisitation of the animal protection legislation?
So look, that'll be a question for Parliament. Yeah.
Okay. One last question, Mr. Benazia.
Just quickly, Mr. Hansen, have there been any other applications by other ACOs or any other charities to become an ACO? Because we're going to witness statements from another charity that claims to be the leading organisation for animal rights, and I'm just wondering if they're the leading organisation for animal rights. One would imagine that they'd maybe have put in a submission to become one of these ACOs.
If I answer really quickly and say not that I'm aware of, can I sort of make another comment as well?
Yeah.
Because I know a lot of what we've focused on here has been the compliance end and how you get to the compliance end. I thought I might just point to the fact so much of the work that we do, so much of the work that New South Wales Police does, so much of the work that RSPCA and Animal Welfare League do, in fact, the vast majority of what RSPCA and Animal Welfare League do is actually avoiding arriving at the need for compliance by actually getting self-compliance through education, training, awareness, all the way up. So we mentioned before about stock welfare panels. They're a great case in point. More than 50% of the stock welfare panels we've had formed in this last year never progressed going past getting a group of experts in a room to sit down with a local producer and help them understand what the nutritional requirements are for the animals they're meant to be keeping, and actually giving them that advice and holding their hand in helping them rectify that situation. That's a great story, but doesn't hit the trigger of, is it a compliance activity, is it a compliance stat, or even when we do reach that, we've had one case just recently it was 440 days of working with that family to try to resolve before it reached that, which included over 50 visits from agencies to try to assist. So I'd flag the fact that whilst we've dealt predominantly here about the actual compliance and enforcement piece, so much of the work of the agencies actually goes well before that in terms of trying to alleviate and avoid the actions that actually result in us needing to use those legislative powers that we have.
Prevention of cruelty. Thank you very much for your input. That was much appreciated.
Questions on notice?
Yes, so we have questions on notice, and you'll have 21 days to respond.
Can I just add one other very quick one on notice? Just the MOU between the department and the Animal Welfare League and the RSPCA.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you.